Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we discuss research-backed strategies and techniques with recognized thought leaders that will deliver results that matter and create lasting change for leaders at all levels. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I am delighted today to be joined by Alex Brueckmann, the founder and CEO of Brueckmann Executive Consulting, based in Vancouver, Canada. As a strategy facilitator, speaker, and author, he helps businesses reach unmatched levels of alignment, performance, and results. He has impacted thousands of business leaders worldwide, ranging from startups to Fortune 50 companies. His latest book, The Strategy Legacy: How to Future-Proof a Business and Leave Your Mark, provides a proven process for strategy design combined with the 9 elements of organizational identity framework to align actions for success. And that's going to be our topic for today's program. Welcome to the program, Alex.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Charles.
Always, I like to have my first question be with all my guests is just give our listeners a little more background about you and what got you interested in this topic and why you wrote this book.
2 questions that have nothing to do with each other. I try to bring them into one cohesive story because they do link in a way. The topic of business strategy was not on my radar until I was about 30 years old, I would say. That's when I graduated from business school. I had this whole other career before business school. Originally, I'm a trained radio journalist, so I designed and hosted radio shows. It was just a music journalist, like on the road, interviewing bands and artists. And, I really enjoyed that. Went to business school and joined, again, the media industry, but this time on the management side of things, not on the content creator side of things. And there I had the opportunity to work with the CEO that asked me to become his strategy manager in the context of a restructuring, which was on the one hand really interesting, on the other hand obviously not so fun. It's always fun to grow businesses, not to restructure them. But that was kind of when I had when I saw the real impact that business strategy can have, other than, the theoretic talks in business school. It was real this time. And I enjoyed it a lot. So I stayed in that lane for multiple years. First in that organization, then I became a management consultant with a large management consulting company. And didn't enjoy that too much because it was too process oriented and not, for my taste, not enough about the people. And then I made it my mission kind of to build a business that incorporates leadership and strategy into one cohesive approach. Well, and then, I don't know, 6 years later or so, I met a girl, and that girl is from Canada. So I was like, okay, if you want to go back home, let's do that. So that's how I ended up here. And in that process of moving from Germany to Canada, I had this feeling of guilt of leaving my clients behind in Europe. You know what I mean? At the same time, I was moving closer to those in North America, but it was that weird feeling. And in the end, that feeling triggered the thought of, can I give them something that works if I'm not present? So I wrote down my ideas, I wrote down some concepts, and I realized I just kept writing and writing and writing. And all of a sudden it was like, I don't know, 80, 100,000 words or something like that. So that is way more than I ever intended. And it was just a nightmare. So I started working with an editor, and that was how the strategy legacy came about.
Wonderful. I love the book and the approach that you take. And I love your approach too, because you suggest that strategy is so central that it sits at the heart of organizational identity. Why is that the case?
That's a good question. Just because I say that doesn't mean everyone sees it that way. I believe it because that's kind of what I've experienced over the past 15 years, where organizations were addressing certain elements of their identity kind of in a vacuum. So, for example, organizations approach me, want to talk about values and purpose. Others approach me, they want to talk about their vision and the strategy to reach that vision. And again, others approach me to talk about executive development and leadership training. So the thing is, it doesn't matter where you start. In the end, the questions that you need to answer to get the most value out of a program that addresses whatever you want to address, these answers, if you don't have these answers, you can't make these programs truly valuable for the people that go through them. And there is no single element of identity that has that reach like strategy has. You can design a purpose statement if you want. You can talk about values if you want, all without answering any of these other questions. But when you put them together, the puzzle pieces need to fit. And strategy, if you approach it through the strategy process, strategy is the only element that really touches all the others in detail. So if you use the strategy process to create all these other elements and answer those questions that are related to them, people see how everything connects. And there is also a very practical reason. A strategy process is typically pretty intense. It takes resources, it takes a lot of time for the people involved to go through a strategy process to create that 3, 5, 6 year strategy, whatever it is that works for your organization. So when you have them anyway involved in a process like that, why not make use of those brilliant brains and also start to talk about these things that are related? So it's a practical reason, but it's also a very thorough reason based on what I've seen in organizations when they try to create, for example, an executive development program without having a clear business strategy in place. That is just, it's not really valuable, because the moment you start talking about executive development, you need to make it real. And it doesn't get much realer um, if you talk about business strategy and about the future of the organization. That's about as real as it gets for an executive.
So I love that practical framework. I wish more companies adopted it. In your book, you give 9 elements of organizational identity, which is a framework and a toolbox for business leaders to grow their strategy legacy in 3 directions: the people they serve, the organizations they represent, and a society as a whole. How does this legacy try and really holistically guide their decision making?
The strategy trident is an idea or a concept that kind of emerged over years in my head when I looked at what is it that leaders truly impact, or what is it that makes an impactful leader. And of course, we know we've all been through leadership development programs in big organizations, and we know that there are 3 dimensions basically: leading self, leading others, and leading organizations, right? Or teams, or you as you wish. And the thing is, when you look at those elements, what you realize is that at least from my perspective, the reason why you become a leader can be in either of those perspectives. It can be either, I want to become a better leader because I want to lead myself in a better way. It can be, I want to become a leader because I really want to make an impact and a dent in people's lives and shape the way they lead, shape the way they show up. Or you are the leader of an organization at some point and you think beyond those realms. You think about the positive impact that your organization can have on society, for example, by restructuring or reshaping your purchasing processes and your supply chains, how you pay living wages, whatever the approach might be, or the thought process might be. What combines all these elements is that they only work if you become a leader because you want to. And that sounds really odd. When you hear that sentence, that can sound really odd, because why wouldn't you, right? But the reality is very, very different. I would guess that more than half of the leaders that I've ever worked with have become leaders by accident, not by choice. They were asked at some point, "Hey, you're such a great sales guy. Can you teach that to others? We make you the sales manager of that department." And they were like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." You're in your mid-20s, late 20s. You haven't really thought that whole process through. You haven't really ever thought about whether a leadership career is something that you're interested in. And you kind of stumble into it. And all of a sudden, you're part of that and you don't know what to do with it. So the leadership trident gives you orientation around what element it is that you want to purposefully address in the way you lead. And what I write about in the book is about how different people can perceive those elements of the trident, right? So while you can be a wonderful developer of talent, your team might love you because you're a great coach, a great mentor to them. It can be that you do all your leadership work in an organizational context that society rejects. They can say, like, society can say, your work is not moral. I do not like the way you treat people. I do not like the way your organization shows up in the real world. Like, for example, if you're a mining company, chances are there are many people out there that are not really in line with what you tell the world that you're giving the world, right? You're digging for precious metals, totally fine, but in the process, you may be destroying habitat at scale because you remove the topsoil, you dig deep, and that destroys habitat for animals, and it's just depending very much on the viewpoint of anyone who looks at you and your leadership. So giving you an idea of how those different spikes of the trident connect and how you can use them consciously, that is something that I wish more leaders would do.
So, what I love about the book and a nuance to your approach is really creating an impact and leaving a lasting legacy is so important to strategy. And you really emphasize that. And you say that finding your purpose matters, your intent matters. However, even though it may seem contrary at first, you shouldn't start with a search for your why.
Well, I guess the search for your why it's so single focused that it can be really frustrating if you don't find a good answer, you know? And I'm talking from a perspective of having gone down that route and having searched for my why. And I always find it interesting when people are totally clear about their purpose because I never really was, despite the fact that I do this for a living. And that was really interesting for me. So I asked myself at some point, why is that? And I realized that I think I have not become a cynic yet, but I have seen so many organizations and so many people that only talk about purpose and do nothing to fulfill it. And that type of purpose washing kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I think what we've seen since, let's say, over the past 20 years, a lot of organizations have embraced that concept of why. Simon Sinek's books, Start With Why, caused quite a wave, and organizations started to embrace those ideas. The problem is when they stop at why. They use those purpose statements for marketing purposes. They talk about their purpose. But then when you kind of put the finger on the pulse and try to measure what's really going on, you're not seeing that big of an impact. And I'm obviously generalizing. There are a lot of organizations who are doing great work based on their purpose. The thing is, what is purpose? What is impact? What is strategy? These are words, and very often people just don't connect them. Your strategy is your vehicle to put your purpose into action to achieve impact. That's how those three elements connect. But when you look at most companies, they first of all, they don't really have a strategy. What they have is some sort of what they call a strategic plan, some kind of 12-month budget operating plan or whatever you want to call it. But for decades, organizations have used that terminology and it kind of has manifested into that's our strategy. Well, not really. That's not really what strategy is. What you have is a plan, and you need both. But if you only have a plan, there is just no way you can, over the long term, take your purpose and put it into action. Because honestly speaking, a 12-month plan is great, but a lot of things that we want to achieve, if I take a look at organizations' purpose statements, you can't achieve those in a very short term. You need time. And that's when there appears to be a disconnect between the plan of an organization, the purpose, and what they call a strategy. Only if you bring those together into a cohesive approach will you ever do anything tangible and measurable and impactful based on your purpose.
When we look at business strategy, we typically address the midterm time horizon, the 3 to 5 years. You recommend, though, that we should also explore what lies before and beyond this time frame to complement the strategy to look at with foresight and signaling. So perhaps you can unpack those two.
When you talk about strategy with organizations, what they typically think about is, as you said, it's like a 3 to 5 year time horizon. It's relatively close. It doesn't appear too far away, so you can wrap your head around it. And it's not like a 3 month plan that is basically the moment you talk about it, it's about time to move it into action. Otherwise, that time is already gone. So that is strategy, 3 to 5 years. Shorter, that's what signaling does. Signaling is less strategic, it's more tactical, more operations focused. It's meant to identify short-term threats to your business continuity, if you want. But those threats are so large that they do have an impact if you do not take care of them. A great example is our organizations that understand the geopolitical landscape, right? So when we talk about geopolitical threats and impacts to supply chains, for example, through wars or other conflicts, there are organizations that are really fast in understanding what does it mean if Russia invades Ukraine? What does that mean, right? So, and we've all seen the conversations around grain supply for especially Africa that is heavily impacted by that conflict. So some companies understand that when they read something in the news, that they need to take this thought or this information and do something with it and think about how does that impact us short term. Many organizations do it, many organizations don't do it. The issue is if you don't do it and there is a big impact, it can derail your business in such such scope that there is no business left afterwards. It can be so critical for you that you don't survive that shock. We've all seen thousands of businesses just disappear in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were not fast enough to change their business model. They were not fast enough to adopt. Very often, these organizations were not particularly healthy in the first place. And the shifts that came through the pandemic were just the coffin, the nail in the coffin, right? So that's about signaling. When we talk about the longer term, when we talk about strategic foresight, that is an entirely different concept than strategy as such. When we talk about strategy, we talk about, what Roger Martin said, strategy is the choices that you make to win in your chosen marketplace, where the opposite of those choices aren't plain stupid. That's how we define strategy, right? When we talk about foresight, we really talk about something that you cannot plan. It's impossible. It's so far ahead. We're talking about 10 years from now. You need to imagine how the world might look like, how your consumers, your customers that you have today might consume your services or related services in the future. And the interesting thing is this is nothing that happens in the boardrooms, right? Strategy often happens in a boardroom. It's the top executives that make those decisions, that make those choices to win in your chosen marketplace. When we talk about foresight, that's not the executives anymore. That only organizations that democratize the strategy process as such do proper foresight. What they do is they have teams of people who create scenarios about how the world might look like at some point in the future. They crunch demographics data with, geopolitical outlooks. And then they also throw like industry specific foresight into the mix. And out of that, they create scenarios, kind of big bets. And then they test those bets. And what they sometimes realize that, hey, wait a minute, I guess we're onto something here. Like weird stuff. But sometimes those weird ideas trigger really great ideas. Foresight is so important for especially larger organizations because they can completely change the landscape in which you operate. Let's talk about a company we all know, Three Stripes. When you talk about sport and apparel, the way people consume sport or practice sport has been shifting tremendously. The whole rise of esports, for example. So the question is, for an apparel company like Adidas, what does that mean? How do they use this trend and accelerate a trend that is favorable for them, right? So unless you allow yourself to identify those trends, to identify and create foresight, you won't be able to use such ideas and trends and accelerate them. The reason you would do it is if you are the one who identifies the trend and can accelerate it, you can literally strategize your competition out of the market. Because the moment you are testing an idea and seeing that it works, gives you such a competitive edge because no one has done it. So there is no urge. You can prepare your game plan and weave that foresight into your then 3 to 5 year strategy plan, if you want to call it that way, and do something absolutely nuts that no one would have expected. But you already tested it, you know it will work. And the time your competition will need to react to that is typically not, you just don't have the time to react to that. You have this typical first mover advantage. You shape a new industry, you open up a new industry segment that you dominate.
You're right. Businesses need to explore what lies before and beyond the typical time frame for their strategy. It very effectively complements their strategy when they can look at the long term, have that foresight, and also signaling in the near term what's going to likely impact within that 3 to 5 year time frame. The other key thing that you mentioned too is the key to a great strategy is having a tangible reason other than profits, other than maximizing shareholder wealth, for employees to come to work every day. Make the work meaningful and expressive and encourage tangible outcomes that everyone can understand, right?
I mean, we can talk about this topic but we shouldn't generalize. There are so many people out there that they go to work because they have bills to pay. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, there is an increasing amount of people for whom that is just not enough anymore. You can always find a job to pay your bills. That's not really, that's not who we are as human beings. We want to do something that we are proud of. We want to do something that gives us meaning. And for some of us, that's a luxury problem. You show up at work, you go home, you take your paycheck, and the reason you do that is to supply and to support your family and to care for the people around you. And that is all the purpose you need. And that's 100% fine. And then there are people who are like, I want to make a dent. I want to use my 8 to 10 hours a day to really move the needle on something that matters to me personally. So that's when people try to find and align organizations whose values align with their personal values. And that is something that I have witnessed multiple times, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. So I've been working with organizations in the pharma industry and diagnostics industry for more than a decade. And the amount of people who had suffered from cancer themselves and therefore started to work for an organization that creates cures for cancer and other diseases I've never seen anything like that before. They don't even think about working for any other organization. And if headhunters approach them, they don't even talk to them. They found work that is deeply aligned with who they are as a human being and what they want to give back to the world. And that is so extremely powerful as an organization. If you can create something like that people don't walk away, that they don't talk to the competition anymore, that they don't talk to headhunters anymore, that's probably the best talent retention tool that you can have. But it comes back to that topic of purpose washing. We might attract talent by those purpose statements and by potential values alignment. But if we then don't live up to that, especially if the leaders in the organization don't live up to that promise, people are also quick to leave the organization again.
And really don't connect it, right, to the level that everyone needs to see how their role contributes to the bigger picture, to the bigger vision, and why their work matters. Because I see that a lot where there's a disconnect, where the senior leadership group is fully committed. They see it, they have the vision, but it hasn't been communicated effectively below them so that the entire organization rallies around it and really uses this as a galvanizing moment moving forward with that vision into the future.
And that is exactly what we talked about in the very beginning, Charles. When you use a strategy process to create the touch points with your employees throughout the organization, helping them understand how they personally contribute to the success of the organization and why that matters. That is the connection between your individual role and the business strategy. That is the connection between your individual role and the impact you want to create through your strategy based on your purpose. That is the connection between my individual values and the transfer that I can make from understanding my individual values to the values that the organization lives up to. So that is why strategy and leadership is so critical in communicating the deeper meaning that an organization can fulfill.
Can really fulfilling its organizational identity. Let's move to strategic styles, because I love how you can bring that in, and how you mentioned basically there's two critical factors when you're identifying or choosing your style, and those are predictability and malleability. And you identified four different styles, but perhaps you can just go into those two critical factors to give our listeners within their organizations an understanding of where they lie on that, which will really lie within those two factors, which will determine what kind of style would be appropriate for their organization.
Those strategic styles, or also as they're sometimes called strategic archetypes, they were brought to the world by Martin Reeves, a business consultant, like Boston Consulting Group veteran, kind of. Wrote many great books about leadership. And the reason I love this concept so much is it's because it's so applicable to everyday communications between what I do and what my clients want to achieve. So when we are in a strategy in a boardroom talking about business strategy, I ask them what type of strategy they think they need. And when they then ask, what do you mean? I give them those two terms: malleability of your industry and predictability. And you wouldn't believe the heat, the intensity of the conversations that sometimes come from that. And I share a practical example. Just a few weeks back, I was facilitating a strategy process with an Inc. 5000 company, one of those fast growing startups. And when I asked them which industry they're in, because I mean, you can't understand the malleability and the predictability of your industry if you don't understand which industry you're in the first place, it was impossible for them to answer which industry they were in, which was amazing to see because it's an extremely successful company. They make tons of money and they have no idea which industry they're in. That was something that I really thought I would never see in my life. But it unveiled something that I think is absolutely critical, which is executive alignment on the absolute core aspects of your business. You don't need to understand the industry you're in when you start a business. You identify a need and you cater to the need. But as you grow, I mean, how do you even grow if you don't know which industry you're in? Because, the industry you're in is, in the end, defines your competitors. If you don't know who your competitors are, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Up to a certain size, your competition doesn't even matter because you're so small that there's always enough room to grow. But for large organizations, take Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus, Paramount, all these streaming services. If you compare those, there isn't an indefinite market potential. So the question is, if you don't realize in which industry you're in, how can you start to create strategy that helps you grow in your industry? So it's an interesting conversation that we're having, and it's still ongoing. So understanding the malleability of your industry matters because it basically defines whether, what we talked about earlier, can you use foresight to completely change how the industry works, how the industry operates, and thereby dominate the industry. When we talk about predictability, that really defines, for example, how you invest your money. If your industry is highly unpredictable, it's probably very unlikely that you put all your money into one basket and make a big bet, right? But if it's more predictable, you can build on longer research and development cycles. You can invest into something longer term. And yeah, I think having this conversation about which industry are we in, how predictable is it, how malleable is it, is just extremely important at the beginning of any strategy cycle for any organization.
Thank you for unpacking those terms. And those four are classical style, adaptive style, shaping style, and the final one is visionary style. It just really depends on kind of your industry. Just hitting on or touching upon one of those. The adaptive style is really what you bring as an example, the fashion industry. This is the best style for uncertain or unpredictable environments, which I think a lot of people find themselves in these days, where flexibility trumps long-term planning because things are just changing so rapidly. You can't predict it, and unfortunately, you can't really change it. So planning cycles in this industry need to be shorter than in some of the other styles, and companies would rather move fast and test hypotheses and experiment than analyze every last detail before moving, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
I've always loved this quote by Peter Drucker, and I love how you state that you don't necessarily agree with this. And the quote by Drucker that I'm referring to is, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." Why is it that you really can't embrace that wholeheartedly?
So, first of all, Peter Drucker never said that. That's one of the most famous misquotations in the management world. And for everyone out there who doesn't believe me, go to the website of the Peter Drucker Forum, and they have an entire page of Peter Drucker misquotations, and this one is amongst them. But that's not the reason. The main reason is that I just don't think it's true. I have never seen it that way. And I think it depends on how you define strategy and how you define culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast indicates that no matter how brilliant your strategy is, if it is not aligned with the culture of an organization, it will fail. Well, there are many examples out there that can be used to underpin that statement. On the other hand, I think that is just an excuse for management failure, to be very honest. And I've been there myself. I've seen it when organizations use the culture of their teams, of an organization as a whole, as an excuse to avoid the difficult conversations, to make the unpopular choices. And that is not really helpful for the organization. And neither is it for the people in the organization. On the other hand, when you use a strategy process consciously to talk about values, to talk about your purpose and your impact, to talk about what it is that the organization really does, what it brings to the world, what it is uniquely positioned to bring to this world, other than just, creating shareholder value. And at the same time, you create an environment where everyone in the business achieves results based on an understanding of how they contribute, when they also then have enough training and development opportunities so that you don't set them up for failure. You can't just tell people, we are now doing X and your role is this. If you don't help people become proficient at it, they become frustrated and demotivated because they will apparently fail on the way of working toward their goals. So if you manage to bring all these elements together, and those are the 9 elements of organizational identity that you mentioned in the beginning, Charles, if you bring all of them together, you create an environment where people not only understand what they're doing, they also understand why they're doing it. And they also understand why things might have to change. And a lot of times, that's what we actually mean when people use the term culture eats strategy for breakfast. What they actually mean is that the organization is change averse, or that leadership is not able to create a compelling vision and a compelling narrative to bring people with them on the journey. Now, for some organizations, that is not that relevant, depending on the legal and regulatory environment in which they're in, depending on the labor laws in a certain country. You let those people go. If they don't want to go with you, they will find something else, right? But then there are countries, especially in Europe, that have strict labor laws. You can't just let people go just because they are not willing to move with you along the way. And that is when the real challenge starts. That's when we see leaders that complain about complacency in the organization. But in the end, if you point your finger to someone, there are at least 3 fingers pointing back at you. And that is the thing. When we complain about culture, it's us as corporate leaders, as company owners, as founders, as entrepreneurs. We shape the culture by how we show up, how we lead, how we walk the talk. We can't just, talk about one thing and do another thing. That shapes culture like nothing else. So culture eats strategy for breakfast? Yeah, maybe in some cases. But, it's your job as a leader to shape an organization. And that means use your strategy process to bring more to the organization than just another cost-cutting program.
Very well said. And until I read your book, I attributed that quote to Drucker. So I'm glad that I was corrected by that and know that that wasn't the case. So getting more into these 9 elements of organizational identity, they're structured in 3 concentric circles. I'd like to go through each set of 3 and maybe just profile one of the 3 in each circle, just to give our listeners more insight into these 9 elements. And the first one we'll start with is the inner circle, which includes impact, mission, and principles, which form the foundation of who we are as a business. Now, we can't unpack all three. We don't have the time to do that, but love to kind of talk about that first one, impact. Because the first element of identity is really the impact, right? It translates your purpose into action, which we've already stated, fuels the fire. Impact and purpose motivate employees and other stakeholders to perform at their best daily. But really, impact is more than that, right? We want to make sure that we go beyond those financial metrics and really find ways in which we can impact all of our employees and make them perform or help them to perform the best versions of themselves on a daily basis.
That's correct. Impact can come in multiple forms. And depending what type of business you are, impact can mean something entirely different. When you're a for-profit organization, impact can mean or will mean something different compared to, let's say, an environmental protection agency or a government agency, a not-for-profit company. Some of these organizations, they exist purely because of their impact statement. They don't care about anything else but making an impact. When we talk about that, what we typically mean, for example, environmental protection agencies, when you take a look at Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, for example, the reason they exist is to stop the exploitation of habitat and whaling, for example. It's a big theme. So that's what they became famous for with their ships when they blocked the whaling companies that operate in international waters where there is simply no legislation. So that's the impact that they want to make. If you bring it back to, let's say, a for-profit company context, you can take a look at companies like Patagonia, who used parts of the profit that they made to fund organizations that work in an area where they, Patagonia, believe it's good to invest money in, not to make more money with it, but actually giving money away. What that cost for Patagonia over decades was that they actually attracted a certain clientele that was willing to pay premium prices for their products simply because they knew that this company is consciously decreasing their negative impact of doing business on the world, and at the same time invested money into preserving, for example, undeveloped land from being developed and protecting habitat. And if you and here we go full circle. If we then talk about why is that, we point to Yves Chouinard, the founder of the organization, who has always been kind of a weird man in the sense of capitalism. He was always looking for ways to lead a company in different ways, and that thinking led him to 1.5 years ago, he gave away the company. Literally, he gave it away. He doesn't own the company anymore. He gave it to a fund, a trust that will prevent the organization from being sold. That means the organization will indefinitely exist as long as they make money, of course. It's a for-profit organization. And they will use all the profit that they don't need to reinvest into the business to go into environmental protection. So if you think about impact, if you think about the personal legacy or the legacy trident of Yves Chouinard, when you bring all these ideas together, the legacy trident, the impact that he creates personally, the impact that he creates through leveraging the power of an organization like Patagonia, that's when impact becomes something tangible, something measurable. Life saved, square miles of forest protected from deforestation. You can measure your success. So all of a sudden, the fluffy talk about purpose becomes something very specific, very concrete. You can measure your impact. And I think organizations who do that, they create, again, a flywheel within their organization. They attract the right type of people who want to support that purpose. And I believe that when you start as an organization, if you start thinking around the positive impact that you want to create in the world, that definitely doesn't set you up for failure. That will set you up for success. But it's something that is, for some people, it seems to be still tree hugger stuff. They haven't understood that there's a business case in doing the right thing.
You're absolutely right. I wish more organizations would embrace that as well, because there's those organizations are highly successful and they're making a real difference in the world and impact. Moving to the middle circle is the strategic core of a organization's identity. It's going to answer the questions, what will your business look like in a few years from now? What are your strategic priorities? And what are the key goals will you reach? And it consists of vision, strategy maps, and goals. Perhaps you can unpack one of those for our listeners and just give more insight into that one.
It's actually relatively easy to unpack them all three in one cohesive way. Strategy maps, if you think about what a strategy map is, it's a tool to visualize your priorities as an organization. You derive those priorities from your vision. So that's why you start with crafting a vision statement. And I'm not talking about a fancy marketing claim that you put on a website. I'm talking about a clear understanding of how the organization will look like in a few years from now. And then you make it measurable. You ask yourself, how can we measure progress toward the vision? And from those measuring criteria, you ask yourself, okay, if that measures our progress toward what we want to become, we better make sure we invest our time and money into the right priorities. And that's when you ask yourself, what are the 3 to 5 big priorities that would really move the needle? And that's what you then invest in. Those are the choices that you make as an organization to invest into, I don't know, X amount of services in your portfolio. You invest in a certain product, you invest into your people. So that's where your focus actually goes to. And when we talk about goals, I use goals in a very specific way in strategy projects. Goals are for me the smart goals that sit within these priorities in your strategy map. Those are what make your strategy measurable. That's literally when we talk about communication, we talked about how can we help organizations to communicate strategy in ways that everyone in the organization understands what it's all about. That's where goals are so central, because that makes, nice sounding words and transform those nicely sounding words into something that people can go like, oh, I can see that. That makes sense. I can work toward that. And that becomes really interesting when you use these goals then and you break them down into, let's say, role specific contributions. So all of a sudden, I don't know, your corporate lawyer team in Japan understands how they contribute to implementing the strategy in the same way as your outbound sales team in Brazil understands it. But they need to break those measures down. They need to break down the vision, the priorities, and the goals to make sense for them. And that's the, in my opinion, that's the biggest responsibility that any leader in any business has, to help their people understand how they contribute to the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And that operational breakdown of strategy is so crucial because it's the people that are going to be implementing the strategy, not the senior leaders. And they need to have that understanding. Let's move to the outer circle, which enables your organization to put strategy into action and live up to your identity. And it answers the questions, what do we need to learn? How do we enable and empower action? And how do we anchor transformation? And the three pieces of this outer circle are targets, capabilities, and then your management system. Speak to us a little bit about those and unpack that for our listeners.
We already talked about the individual targets and where they're coming from. They're coming from those goals in your strategy. But that's only the strategic piece. Goals and individual targets, they also come from other areas than just your strategy. They also come from, how do we live up to our values? What does that mean in our interactions with each other on a daily basis? How we interact with our customers, how we interact with suppliers. There can be targets that are not strategy related, but related to other aspects of your identity. When we talk about capability building, we talk about skills. We talk about training and development for everyone in the business. And that includes the executive leadership team. They actually need to go first. And here's why. When you create a new strategy for a business and you know everything already in how you implement that strategy, then this strategy isn't worth the paper it's written on. If you already know how to get to your goals, then, what's the point? Why haven't you done it in the first place already? If your strategy reads like a business continuity program because you already know, then it's not strategy. Then it's something else. It might be something great. I mean, business continuity is wonderful, operational excellence rules, but if it's not strategy, if it's that. So every strategy comes with change, and change means we need new skills. And executives need to role model, the vulnerability in saying, I do not know everything that we will have to know on our way to achieving our vision. If you do that as an executive team, you invite others to do the same. Maybe some of our listeners have experienced that themselves when organizations roll out big training programs and you feel like you're not being sent to some kind of training but being sentenced to training. Kind of, why do I have to do this? This does not make any sense. And that typically happens when organizations design wonderful leadership development programs or skill building programs, and people have no clue why they need those skills. There is just this disconnect between, we think you should learn skill X because it will help you with task Y, which is connected to our strategy in this particular way. But many organizations, they just create learning and development programs because, they've always done it a certain way, not because they help the organization to move toward their strategy. And this typically happens when we have people in culture departments or HR departments that do not speak the language of the business and for whichever reason have not been involved in the design of the strategy. So we need to break this cycle at some point so that HR doesn't create great training programs. In itself, the smile sheets might look wonderful. People think the trainer was very knowledgeable. Of course they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a trainer, right? So all these things that we need to break through these, old patterns of creating training programs, capability building programs that is nice to have, but that doesn't have a strategic focus. And that is one of the management systems that we need to reshape when we talk about strategy and identity. Management systems simply means, how do we make sure that we follow through? How do we have to adjust the processes of our organization, the way we implement strategy, for example, the way we review our progress, so that it supports the strategy and it doesn't hinder the strategy. One of the examples, which is very relatable, would be your remuneration and incentive structures. If incentives and remuneration structures aren't adjusted to your new strategy, people will not move. They will continue to do the things the way that they've done it if that means they can maximize their remuneration or their year-end bonus. But if you move the needle and you adjust those systems, you help people change. You help people understand that it's a different kind of behavior that we want to see, that it's a different kind of how you show up in the workplace every day that we want to see. That does move the needle, and you need to help people also with these remuneration incentive structures and adjust them to your strategy.
All three are equally critical. I agree with you, and they can be done in unison. What I find, since we're a leadership development company, is that capability piece that you touched upon, that states that there's always that disconnect between the HR and the L&D training and really measuring true business impact. And I love the advice you give. It's that the first step in addressing this disconnect is enable HR and L&D functions to learn some critical skills themselves and become true partners of the business. So this includes our ability to understand the business model, the numbers involved, and most importantly, which I don't think a lot of people get, is speak in business language. Because you hear a lot of L&D and HR, and they have that learner speak, right? That doesn't connect well with the business function.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is true. I've been in this industry for so long. I can tell you by the language that you use which department you belong to.
Sad but true. You're right. Are there any other key insights or takeaways that you want our listeners to make sure they start doing as a result of our conversation today, Alex?
You mean apart from picking up the book and reading it, putting it into action? Just start somewhere. You don't need to be a perfect strategist or a perfect leader to start doing something based on the book. You can just take one valuable element that provided the deepest insight for you and just start. We create change by starting, not by thinking about starting. That's the difference again between purpose and impact. You can create the greatest intentions, but if you don't do anything with it, just pick up some of the pieces that inspired you to do something and start doing it and learn as you go.
That is spot on. Thank you, Alex, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work and pick up your new book.
If you dare to write a German surname correctly, you can go to brueckmann.ca. But if you don't dare to do that, go to alexthestrategist.com, all in one word. There you will find everything about my books, a ton of free resources, and also an opportunity to engage with me, links to LinkedIn, where I literally live. So if you want to have a conversation with me about any topic, reach out to me through the LinkedIn direct messages. It's me who answers. It's not some bot or some other person. I look forward to hearing from you.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?